There is a single word in the Latin Bible that should never have been a name. It was not a name when Jerome wrote it in the 4th century. It was not a name in the Hebrew text he was translating. It was not a name in the Greek Septuagint that preceded him. It was an adjective, a description. A perfectly ordinary Latin word meaning light-bearing, the same word Romans used for the planet Venus when it appeared before dawn, the morning star that announced the coming of the sun. The word was Lucifer. And somewhere between the 4th century and the medieval period, that adjective became a name, and that name became a biography, and that biography became the most influential portrait of evil in Western history. A being of incomparable beauty who stood at the right hand of God, who led a rebellion in heaven, who was cast down into darkness, and who has spent every moment since dedicated to the corruption and destruction of the human race. The problem is that none of that is in the original text. Not the name, not the rebellion in heaven, not the fall, not the beauty, not the biography, all of it. Every element of the story of Lucifer that has shaped Western art, literature, theology, and imagination for 1,500 years was constructed from a single mistranslation of a single Hebrew word in a single passage of the prophet Isaiah that was written not about a supernatural being at all, but about a dead Babylonian king. Let that sit for a moment. The most famous villain in Western religious history, the being who appears in Dante's Inferno, frozen at the center of hell, who appears in Milton's Paradise Lost as the greatest tragic figure in the English language, who appears in thousands of years of Christian theology as the adversary of God himself, began as a mistranslation of a taunt song about a human tyrant who died in the 6th century before the Common Era. And the trail of that mistranslation, when you follow it carefully through the Hebrew and the Greek and the Latin and the councils and the theologians and the poets, reveals something that nobody in mainstream religious discourse wants to say out loud. The devil as we know him was not revealed. He was constructed piece by piece, century by century, from borrowed mythology, political theology, and one catastrophically influential translation error. Welcome to this channel where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand how Lucifer was created, you have to go back to the original passage. Isaiah chapter 14. It is one of the most dramatic pieces of poetry in the entire Hebrew Bible, and it is addressed to someone very specific. The text makes this explicit. It is a mashal, a taunt, or a proverb directed at the king of Babylon, not at a supernatural being, at a human king. A king so powerful, so arrogant, so destructive that the prophet reaches for the most extreme language available to him to describe the magnitude of his fall. The Hebrew word Isaiah uses is Hellel, from a root meaning to shine or to boast. Hellel ben Shachar, shining one, son of the dawn. This is almost certainly a reference to Venus, the morning star, the brightest object in the pre-dawn sky, which appears to rise higher than all other stars before being extinguished by the light of the sun. It is a perfect metaphor for a king who rose to dazzling heights and then fell catastrophically. The Babylonian king, in Isaiah's poetry, is the morning star who thought he could ascend to the heavens, who thought he could sit on the mountain of the gods, who thought he could make himself like the Most High, and who instead descended to the depths of the pit. This is magnificent poetry. It is not cosmology, it is not angelology, it is a funeral dirge for a tyrant, using the imagery of a falling star to describe the arc of imperial overreach and inevitable collapse. The ancient world was full of this kind of imagery. The Babylonians themselves used the morning star as a symbol of powerful kings and heroes. The imagery of a brilliant being falling from heaven was a well-understood metaphor in the ancient Near Eastern world. Isaiah's original audience would have understood immediately that he was talking about a dead king, not a fallen angel. The Greek translators of the Septuagint, working in Alexandria in the centuries before the Common Era, translated Hellel as Hieosphoros, the Greek word for the morning star, Venus. This was a perfectly accurate translation. Hiosphoros was the standard Greek word for the planet Venus in its morning appearance. It was not a name. It was not a supernatural being. It was an astronomical reference. And then came Jerome. Jerome, working in the late 4th century on what would become the Latin Vulgate, translated Hiosphoros into Latin as Lucifer. And here is where the first fateful step occurs. Lucifer was, in Jerome's time, the standard Latin word for the morning star. Cicero used it, Pliny used it. It was an ordinary astronomical term. Jerome's translation was, in purely linguistic terms, correct. He was translating morning star into its Latin equivalent. But by Jerome's time, something had already happened in Christian theology that would transform this ordinary translation into something else entirely. A reading of the Isaiah passage had already begun to develop, particularly in the writings of Origen and Tertullian in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, that interpreted the fall of the Shining One not as a metaphor for a Babylonian king, but as a literal description of the primordial fall of Satan from heaven. These theologians were connecting Isaiah 14 with a passage from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verse 18, where Jesus says to his disciples, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." This connection was not linguistically justified. The Isaiah passage is explicitly addressed to the king of Babylon. The Luke passage is a brief cryptic statement by Jesus that scholars still argue about today, and its relationship to Isaiah 14 is far from obvious. But the theological need for a narrative of Satan's origins was strong. Christianity had inherited from Jewish apocalyptic tradition a fully developed figure of a supernatural adversary, and that adversary needed a backstory. How did he become evil? When did he fall? What was he before? Isaiah 14, read through the lens of Luke 10:18, seemed to provide the answer. The brilliant being who fell from heaven, the one who wanted to be like God, the one who descended to the pit. And when Jerome's translation gave that being the Latin name Lucifer, the name stuck because it was beautiful, because it was evocative, because it captured something that the theologians felt was true about the nature of evil, that it was not merely darkness but fallen light, not mere ugliness but corrupted beauty. Here is something that almost nobody in mainstream religious discourse discusses openly. The story of Lucifer's fall from heaven, which most Christians treat as straightforward biblical fact, is not actually in the Bible in the form most people believe it to be. The book of Revelation describes war in heaven and the casting out of Satan and his angels. Isaiah 14 describes a fallen morning star. Luke 10:18 has Jesus mention seeing Satan fall. But the fully developed narrative, the one with the beautiful archangel, the pride, the rebellion, the battle, the expulsion, the transformation into the hideous Lord of Hell, that narrative is assembled from these fragments by theologians and poets working across several centuries, and it reaches its most influential form not in scripture but in extra biblical texts, most powerfully in John Milton's Paradise Lost, written in 1667, which is not the Bible, but which has shaped popular Christian imagination about Satan more than almost any other single work. This is worth pausing on. The version of Lucifer that most people carry in their heads, the proud and beautiful rebel, the tragic figure who would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven, is largely a 17th century English poet's imaginative construction built on top of a 4th century Latin mistranslation of a 6th century BCE Hebrew taunt song about a dead Babylonian king. And yet it is treated by millions of people as revealed theological truth. To understand how this happened, you need to understand what Christianity needed from a devil and why. The early Christian movement inherited a complex and not entirely consistent picture of supernatural evil from its Jewish matrix. In the Hebrew Bible, the figure called the Satan, which in Hebrew means the adversary or the accuser, is not the cosmic opponent of God that later Christian theology would make him. In the book of Job, the most extended treatment of this figure in the Hebrew Bible, the Satan is a member of God's divine council. a kind of prosecuting attorney whose role is to test human beings and report back to God. He operates with God's permission. He is not rebelling against God. He is serving God's purposes, however unpleasantly. The scholar Elaine Pagels of Princeton University, in her landmark work, The Origin of Satan, traces in brilliant detail how the figure of the Satan was gradually transformed from this relatively domesticated divine functionary into the cosmic adversary of God and humanity. Her argument, supported by extensive historical and textual evidence, is that this transformation was driven not by theological revelation but by social conflict. In the period of intense sectarian conflict within Judaism in the 2nd century BCE, and then in the early Christian movement's conflict first with other Jewish groups and later with the Roman Empire, the Satan became the supernatural embodiment of the human enemy. Whoever you were fighting, whoever was persecuting you or opposing you or competing with you for adherence, became associated with Satan. The supernatural adversary gave cosmic significance to earthly conflicts and made compromise with the enemy not merely politically unwise but spiritually treasonous. This is a powerful and disturbing insight. The development of Satan as a fully realized cosmic evil figure tracks almost perfectly with moments of intense social conflict and persecution. When the community is threatened, the adversary grows in power and malevolence. When the community is secure, the adversary recedes. Satan is, in this reading, not a theological given, but a theological variable shaped by the political and social needs of the communities that articulate his nature. But there is another tradition that runs alongside the Christian Satanology, and it is one that almost never appears in popular discussions of where the devil came from. That tradition comes from Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion founded by the prophet Zarathustra, possibly as early as the 2nd millennium BCE, was the first religion in history to develop a fully realized cosmic dualism, a universe divided between a supreme good deity, Ahura Mazda, and a supreme evil deity, Angra Mainyu or Ahriman, who are engaged in a cosmic war that will eventually be won by the good. This is not the ambiguous, complex picture of evil in the Hebrew Bible. This is a fully developed theological system in which evil is a cosmic force with its own ruler, its own agenda, and its own army of demonic beings opposed to God and humanity. The Jewish people lived under Persian rule for approximately 2 centuries, from the fall of Babylon in 539 BCE to the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE. This is the period in which Jewish theology underwent some of its most dramatic developments, including the development of angelology, the development of resurrection theology, the development of apocalyptic literature, and, scholars argue, the development of a much more robust and cosmically powerful figure of supernatural evil. The timing is not coincidental. The encounter with Zoroastrian theology during the Persian period appears to have introduced into Jewish thought a conception of supernatural evil that was more developed, more cosmically significant, and more dualistic than what the earlier Hebrew Bible presents. The scholar Mary Boyce of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, one of the foremost authorities on Zoroastrianism in the 20th century, argued extensively for Zoroastrian influence on Jewish and subsequently Christian and Islamic theology. Her work is detailed and sometimes contested, but the basic observation is hard to dismiss. The world before the Persian period has no developed Satan in Jewish theology, and the world after has one. Something changed. And the most obvious candidate for what changed is the 2 centuries of immersion in a civilization that had already developed the theological category that Judaism was now beginning to construct. From Zoroastrianism, the Christian Lucifer inherited the essential structure of his cosmic role, a being of great power opposed to God, leading an army of supernatural beings against the divine order, seeking the corruption and destruction of humanity. The specific narrative details, the beauty, the pride, the fall from heaven, were assembled later. But the cosmological architecture was Zoroastrian before it was Christian. The Islamic tradition handles the figure of Iblis, the Islamic name for Satan, in a way that illuminates the Christian construction by contrast. In the Quran, Iblis is not a fallen angel. He is a jinn, a being of smokeless fire created separately from the angels. When God commands all beings to bow before the newly created Adam, Iblis refuses. His reason, stated explicitly in the Quran, is pride. He says, I am better than him. You created me from fire and you created him from clay, and God expels him. But here is what is remarkable about the Islamic version. Iblis does not wage war on God. He asks God for a reprieve until the day of judgment, and God grants it. Iblis then dedicates himself to leading human beings astray, not because he can threaten God, but because he wants to prove his point about human unworthiness. This is a fundamentally different cosmology from the Christian one. In the Islamic picture, there is no war in heaven, there is no rebellion, there is no cosmic dualism. God is not threatened by Iblis. God permits Iblis's activity as a test for humanity. Iblis is less a cosmic adversary than a cosmic tempter, an instrument of trial operating entirely within God's sovereign will. The Islamic Iblis has far more in common with the Satan of the Book of Job than with the Lucifer of Christian theology. The difference matters because it reveals something about what the Christian tradition needed from its devil that other traditions did not need in the same way. The Christian Lucifer is a figure of genuine cosmic power, a being who can mount a real challenge to God, who can claim sovereignty over entire kingdoms of the world, who can credibly threaten the divine order. This is a much more theologically dangerous figure than the Islamic Iblis, and it creates theological problems that Christianity has wrestled with for 2 millennia. If God is omnipotent, how can Satan be a genuine threat? If God is good, why does he permit Satan's activities? If God foreknew Satan's rebellion before creating him, is God responsible for evil? These are not questions with easy answers, and the history of Christian theology is in large part a history of attempts to answer them. Augustine's doctrine of evil as privation of good, Aquinas's elaboration of that doctrine, uh, the Protestant reformers' different approaches to the problem of evil, the modern theological attempts to reconcile divine goodness with the reality of suffering, all of these conversations are downstream of a figure whose origins were, as we have seen, considerably more humble and more historically contingent than his theological status would suggest. There is a strand of scholarship associated with thinkers like Neil Forsyth of the University of Lausanne, whose book The Old Enemy traces the figure of Satan from Babylonian mythology through the Hebrew Bible to the New Testament and beyond, that argues the figure of the cosmic adversary is not a theological accident or a mistranslation. It is a theological necessity. Every religious system that affirms a good God must eventually grapple with the reality of evil. And the most narratively satisfying solution to the problem of evil is a personal adversary, a being who is the cause of the suffering that God's goodness cannot be blamed for. This is what Satan does theologically, above and beyond anything his name or his mythology suggests. He solves the problem of evil by personifying it. He gives evil an agent, a will, a biography, a face. And in doing so, he makes it possible to maintain belief in a good and powerful God in the face of a world that often seems to provide evidence against that belief. If the world is not as good as God intended, it is because Satan is working against God's intentions. If your prayers go unanswered, it may be because Satan is interfering. If good people suffer, it may be because Satan is targeting them. This is not merely superstition. It is a sophisticated theodicy, a way of accounting for the gap between the world as it is and the world as faith requires it to be. And it has been extraordinarily effective at sustaining religious belief in the face of suffering and injustice. The question that the historical analysis forces us to ask is whether that effectiveness justifies the construction of the figure or whether the construction has costs that the effectiveness does not cancel out. Because the construction of Lucifer, the cosmic adversary, has had consequences that go well beyond theology. The identification of human enemies with Satan has been one of the most consistently dangerous moves in the history of Western civilization. The Crusades were fought against the armies of Satan. The Inquisition prosecuted the agents of Satan. The witch trials of early modern Europe executed tens of thousands of people for alleged alliance with Satan. The colonial conquest of the Americas was partly justified by the claim that the indigenous peoples were under Satan's power and needed to be liberated from it. The persecution of Jews across European history was repeatedly framed as a struggle against satanic influence. None of this was caused by the mistranslation of a Hebrew word in Isaiah 14. But all of it was enabled by the theological framework that mistranslation helped construct, a framework in which evil is not merely a human failing or a structural problem, but a supernatural force with a face, and in which the identification of your enemy with that force transforms ordinary human conflict into cosmic spiritual warfare. When stakes become infinite, when you are not merely fighting a political enemy, but the embodiment of cosmic evil, the normal constraints on violence dissolve. You cannot negotiate with Satan. You cannot make peace with the adversary of God. You cannot show mercy to those who are instruments of the devil. The logic of spiritual warfare, once invoked, tends toward totality. And the history of the uses of Lucifer as a category for human enemies is a history of totality, of the application of infinite stakes to finite conflicts with predictably catastrophic results. Here is what the scholars know and the preachers rarely say. The word Lucifer appears exactly once in the Latin Vulgate in the passage we have been discussing, Isaiah 14:12. It does not appear in the New Testament in the Latin. The figure of Satan appears extensively in the New Testament, but he is not called Lucifer there. The connection between the name Lucifer and the New Testament Satan was made by theologians, not by Scripture. And the fully developed biography of Lucifer, the pride, the rebellion, the war in heaven, the fall, the transformation into the Lord of Hell, is assembled from Isaiah 14, Luke 10:18, Revelation 12, the Book of Enoch, Zoroastrian cosmology, and the imaginative work of theologians and poets across 15 centuries. It is a magnificent construction. It is one of the most powerful and enduring narrative constructions in human history. It has generated art and literature and music and philosophy of incomparable richness. Dante's frozen Satan at the center of the Inferno, Milton's Satan declaring that the mind is its own place and can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. Blake's figure of the devil as the suppressed energy of human creativity. These are not trivial cultural products. They are among the greatest works in the Western tradition, but they are not the Bible. They are what human beings did with a mistranslation of the Bible. They are what human beings do when they need a figure capacious enough to carry the full weight of their experience of evil, of betrayal, of fallen greatness, of beauty turned to destruction, of the gap between what should be and what is. The figure of Lucifer endures not because Jerome made a translation error, though he did. It endures because it answers something real in human experience. The experience of falling, the experience of pride that destroys what it loves, the experience of light that becomes darkness, the experience of a being that was made for greatness and chose otherwise. These are not experiences that require a supernatural being to be real. They are experiences that every human being who has ever lived knows from the inside. Perhaps that is the deepest secret of Lucifer. He was never really about a supernatural being at all. He was always about us, about the part of every human being that knows what is right and chooses otherwise, about the part that would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven, about the shining potential that falls not because of a war in the heavens, but because of the ordinary, unremarkable, endlessly repeated human decision to put the self before everything else. Isaiah knew this when he wrote about the king of Babylon. He was not describing a supernatural being. He was describing a human type, the type of the person who rises to dazzling heights on the basis of real gifts and real power and then falls catastrophically and completely because they could not survive their own greatness. Jerome gave that human type a name. Milton gave it a voice. And 15 centuries of human beings recognize themselves in it, which is why it has never gone away and never will. Here is the question I want to leave you with, the one worth arguing about in the comments, worth losing sleep over, worth disagreeing with everyone you know about. If if Lucifer was never in the original text, if he was assembled from mistranslation and borrowed mythology and theological necessity and poetic imagination, does that make him less real? Or does the fact that human beings constructed him so carefully and have recognized themselves in him so completely for so long make him more real than any being who simply existed without needing to be invented? What does it mean that we needed him? What does it tell us about ourselves that we looked at the darkness in the world and in our own hearts and reached, not for an explanation, but for a name?